And good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be here today to be able to speak to you on behalf of the Industry Safety Steering Group. And I'd like to begin by thanking the Competency Steering Group and all those who contributed to the various competency working groups. The publication of the Raising the Bar interim report in August this year represented a major milestone in the work that's needed to raise standards in our industry in the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire. The issue of competency, or rather the lack of competency, was one of the key findings of the independent review of building regulations and fire safety led by Dame Judith Hackett. But it was only one of a number of findings that focused attention on an industry that was failing to consistently deliver buildings that were to the right standards of quality and safety. Even before Grenfell, the warning signs were there. In February 2017, I attended a roundtable discussion in Edinburgh following the publication of a report of the independent inquiry into the construction of schools in Edinburgh, which followed the collapse of a gable-end wall at Oxgan School. On that occasion, it was only down to a matter of timing and luck that no one was killed. But the causes of the failure and the potential consequences were laid bare by the report. My own professional body, the Chartered Institute of Building, began an investigation into the issue of quality in the construction industry and what needed to be done to improve it. We wanted to understand the behaviours, both individual and corporate, that were either promoting or preventing the delivery of quality on construction projects. What we discovered was that somewhere along the way, an institutional acceptance of error had crept into the construction process. Quality was being sacrificed to achieve targets, whether that be time or cost, with no real understanding of what that could mean for those who would go on to occupy and use those buildings. And nowhere were the consequences of that approach more shockingly, tragically exposed than on the 14th of June 2017. The impact of that day reverberated around the world. How, people asked, can I not be safe in my own home? It's a question that demanded a response and continues to do so today. Those families who lost loved ones in Grenfell Tower had a right to know why. But more than that, the many people living in high-rise residential buildings needed assurance that they weren't also at risk. The next stage of the independent public inquiry, which begins next year, will investigate the events that led up to the fire. But it will be a while before the findings of that inquiry will be published. And we cannot wait until then to bring about the changes that are needed now to ensure that people today are safe and feel safe in their homes. The initial response focused on the need to identify and remediate buildings that had the same cladding materials as Grenfell Tower. But as we know, the closer we looked at those buildings, the more it became apparent that the issues went much further than just the cladding. Inspections of the completed buildings identified that fire stopping, so critical to preventing the spread of fire, was either incomplete or missing entirely. Coincidentally, this was one of the defects identified by the Edinburgh Schools report and was found to be a factor in the fire at Lacknell House, which claimed the lives of 6 people in 2009. Tests on certified fire doors found they didn't meet the required standards of fire resistance. And research into other types of cladding material have raised questions about their performance in the event of a fire. It was against this backdrop that the then Secretary of State asked Dame Judith Hackett to lead an independent review of building regulations and fire safety. The purpose of the review was to look at how our regulatory system had allowed so many buildings, which are currently not fit for purpose, to be built or modified, and to recommend how the system needed to change to ensure that people living in high-rise buildings are safe and feel safe in their homes. The findings of that review were published in May last year and identified that there was a widespread culture of ignorance and indifference in the industry, which had created a race to the bottom, where the focus was on doing things as cheaply and as quickly as possible, rather than delivering the best quality buildings that were safe for people to live in. And the same ignorance and indifference was found to apply to those who were responsible for managing and maintaining buildings. No one was listening to residents when they raised their concerns, and opportunities to improve safety during refurbishment were being overlooked. The review also examined the regulatory regime and found that the regulatory oversight of enforcement was inadequate and took no account of the need to increase the level of oversight in proportion to the risks associated with a particular type of building. Recognition that high-rise, multi-occupancy buildings are complex systems and as such require a different approach to regulation and enforcement. And finally, the report identified a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities, ambiguity about who was responsible for what, exacerbated by the level of fragmentation in industry, and no clear accountability. But more than that, decisions were being made by people who lacked the competence to understand the consequences of those decisions. And for me, this is central to the work of the Competency Steering Group. It isn't just about ensuring that people are competent. That should be a given. It's about ensuring that the system they operate within promotes the right outcomes and the right behaviours. As an industry, it's time we woke up to the fact that first and foremost, we have a professional and ethical responsibility to do what is right. And that means being prepared to speak up when no one else will. We need more what I refer to as Emperor's New Clothes moments. One of the most shocking things to me about the Edinburgh Schools report was not one person involved with that project said anything, even though the scale of the defect would have been evident to anyone walking onto that site. That could only mean one of three things. They didn't look, or were prevented from doing so. They did look, but didn't know what they were looking at. Or they did look, knew it was wrong, and said nothing. Any of those could have explained what happened, but none of them reflect well on those involved in that project or on our industry. But this was not an isolated occurrence. The report found the same defects in the external wall construction of 16 other schools in Edinburgh. Evidence that the problem is systemic and cultural. Following the publication of the Building a Safer Future report, the government published an implementation plan supporting all of the recommendations in the report. This is important because if we're to bring about the real systemic change that's needed in our industry, we cannot choose to adopt some parts and not others. And I cannot emphasise this point enough. This is about managing the way that we design, procure, construct and manage high-risk residential buildings from the top down and the bottom up. And over time, I believe the system that's being proposed will set the bar for best practice that will be adopted across the sector. During the summer, the government carried out a consultation on the new regulatory regime and received over 900 responses, a strong indication of the level of interest in the proposals. And as we know from the Queen's speech on Monday, legislation is coming. But the message from Dame Judith and from government is clear. Don't wait for legislation to make the changes that are needed now to deliver safer buildings. It was to ensure that the industry was actively working to implement the changes needed to improve building safety and to rebuild public confidence that the Industry Safety Steering Group was established last year. Reporting directly to the Secretary of State, the purpose of the group is to provide constructive challenge to industry and recommend the action that's needed to overcome blockages and accelerate industry culture change. The group, which meets every 2 months, is comprised of representatives from a number of industry sectors, including aviation, oil and gas, and financial services, as well as those working within the regulatory industry. Many of these sectors have undergone cultural change in response to their own tragedies, which is part of what gives the group its strength. Every one of the members of the Industry Safety Steering Group has come to the group because they want to play their part in helping this sector to raise its game and change practices forever. Over the last year, the group has heard from a number of industry bodies and representatives, some more than once. Many of those that we have heard from clearly understand the need for change, recognise the challenges, and are actively working to bring about that change. And I include within that the work being done by the BBA and CPA on products and the work of the Competency Steering Group. But elsewhere, there's a sense that with an industry that is characterised by fragmentation, poor productivity and low margins, change will only happen when it's imposed on us through legislation. For them, the problem is a bit like trying to eat the elephant. And faced with a number of obstacles, whether real or perceived, they would rather wait to be told what to do rather than act now. For those people, the message is clear. Change is coming, and you can either embrace it now or, to use another analogy, like the boiled frog, continue to do things the way you've always done, and, well, we know it doesn't end well for the frog. Yes, there are challenges, but it's how we respond to those challenges that makes the difference. In May last year, the Competency Steering Group set out to develop proposals for an overarching system for overseeing competence in industry. It was a massive task, involving more than 150 professional and trade bodies and 12 working groups. If ever there was an elephant, this was it. And it's a credit to everyone involved in this process that we're standing here today, having made significant progress towards a new system for raising the levels of competence in our industry. But for me, it was how the group responded when faced with the seemingly intractable problem of creating an overarching competency system that stands out. Rather than soldier on, the group approached the Industry Safety Steering Group and asked for help. And as you know, this led to the creation of a new working group chaired by Scott Stedman, the outcome of which is a system for overseeing competence that is both practical and workable. To quote Dame Judith, asking for help is not a sign of weakness but of leadership, which all too often we find lacking in this sector on the first encounter. That's why the primary role of the Industry Safety Steering Group is to challenge the leadership in every branch of the built environment to step up and show that leadership which is needed. The need for strong, decisive leadership has never been greater, and I want to highlight 3 examples. Firstly, insurance. As we know, the sector is seeing a hardening of the insurance market, which is translating into higher premiums and excesses, additional exclusion clauses, and in some cases, an inability to procure cover at all. The steering group is meeting with representatives of the insurance sector next month, but I recently met with a leading insurance broker in the City of London. They cover a number of different industry sectors, but we're keen to point out that this hardening of the market is not confined to the construction sector. However, it is also a fact that recent events have damaged confidence in the ability of our industry to manage the risks that they are underwriting. My view is that our industry has become too reliant on insurance to paper over the cracks of what is essentially a flawed system. We now have the opportunity to correct that, and the work that the CSG has done to raise the bar on competence is a key part of rebuilding competence in the sector. So we would urge you to engage with the insurance sector to continue this work. The second, as we were hearing about earlier, is the new duty holder role of the Building Safety Manager. Before the summer, the Industry Safety Steering Group heard from Working Group 8 about the work that had been done to define the competencies that would be required of the Building Safety Manager. The role has emerged from a recognition that there's a need for an individual to be responsible for managing building safety during the occupation phase of a building, and crucially, where modifications or improvements are made to that building during its life cycle. But unlike the other duty holder roles, which build on established roles under the CDM regulations, this is essentially a new role that requires the development of new training and skills. But it is an essential role within a system that seeks to ensure that residents feel safe and are safe in their homes. For this reason, we have urged Working Group 8 to focus on the competency requirements of this role and to ensure that the training required to perform the role is put in place now, not wait for legislation. And we've also made clear that our view is that seeking to dilute the importance of this role by moving away from the title of manager to that of coordinator is not something that we support. Put simply, the title manager, by definition, implies responsibility for ensuring that what needs to happen does happen. The title coordinator does not. And finally, I want to mention the role of the industry-led Building Safety Competence Committee. This has a key role to play ensuring that the recommendations contained in the Raising the Bar report are implemented. Given the progress that has been made by the CSG towards developing a comprehensive and coherent competence framework for the whole sector, the priority must be to turn this into an industry-wide delivery programme with required leadership and involvement of the working groups and other key stakeholders, including, in our opinion, the CITB. When CITB recently presented to the Industry Safety Steering Group, it became apparent that they were waiting for the industry to come forward with training proposals to be funded, rather than working alongside the working groups to identify training priorities and ensure that the necessary funding is made available. We have written to the CIOB to encourage them to take a more active role in this process, using the resources at their disposal. While significant progress has been made during the last year, we still have a long way to go to bring about the change that's needed in our industry if we are to ensure that the buildings that we create, improve and adapt are safe for those who use them. To quote from the government's implementation plan, the new regulatory framework needs to change the culture and mindset of those involved so they take proper ownership of the potential building safety risks. They must provide intelligent leadership in managing and controlling those risks, rather than being told what to do by government. When I talk to people about quality in our industry, I often describe the buildings that we create as a legacy that we leave behind for future generations. And yet within the last 10 years, we seem to have created a legacy of buildings that not only fail to meet the required standards of quality, but are actually unsafe for those who use them. Can any of us here today put our hand on our heart and say that a tragedy like Grenfell couldn't happen again today? I doubt it. Which is why we need to act now, not wait to be told what to do by government. Remember the boiled frog. What we do as an industry matters, both to the economy and to society, and we create the places that people live, work and play in, the buildings they go to learn and to heal in. But when we get it wrong, the impact on people's lives and their livelihoods can be massive. The Grenfell Tower fire was a wake-up call to our industry. It demanded that we act to ensure that another tragedy like this could never happen again. But the warning signs were already there that something was wrong before Grenfell. So for me, this is more than just about getting it right. It's about doing the right things, and that means facing up to our responsibilities and being prepared to think and act differently. At stake isn't just the reputation of our industry, but the safety and the well-being of those who use the buildings that we design and build and manage. So to close, I want to leave you with two messages. Firstly, the interim report on competency is an important milestone, but there's still a lot of work to be done and the clock is ticking. So I urge you not to wait for the other parts of the system to come together to push ahead with the work that's needed to raise the bar on competencies. And secondly, the Industry Safety Steering Group is here to help. As I've already said, asking for help is a sign of strength, not of weakness. And it's only by pulling together and working together that we'll bring about lasting change in our industry, and change that's needed now if we're to ensure that there is never another Grenfell Tower fire. Thank you for listening.